met her in last year in Austria. I was really willing to invite her physically in Nepal, but thanks to this crisis that we at least get to see you online. And I would like to officially welcome you from FCD Nepal. And first of all, we would have your presentation and a bit of discussion. And the president of Foundation for Critical Discourse Nepal, Dr. Khagendra Prasad, would be summing up all because there are many technical terms in economy that he would also, would make it easier for our Nepali audience. Before moving on to that, why we chose this topic, because I know we saw the plight of migrant workers, not inside the country only, but then informal workers traveling for days to go back to their home when there was all of a sudden lockdown, and we saw the similar plight of workers in Nepal. And we now, when economists are talking about economy and the crisis, they are more focused on the formal economy but less on informal economy. And recently we had our budget speech where the Minister of Finance focused less, I think it was minimal on the informal sector, because they are the people who wouldn't pay the tax, and when the country is making that calculation, then there is the place like they would be seeing through which the country makes a revenue. On the other side, there are also people who are saying that such informal economy should be taxed heavily. But one thing that comes to our mind is the woman who is selling vegetable on the street as a street vendor, or waste speakers, or someone helping us at our home as an informal worker. So all these things come together when we see that, okay, the government is saying that this should be taxed. So in this context of this COVID, their problem is getting more serious. So we wanted that maybe we should talk about it, not because this problem is not only in Nepal but in South Asia. So that's why we have invited Professor Ghosh. So I think it's over to you. We will first have 15 minutes of your presentation, then we'll take questions. We will do that way so that it will be interactive. And if there is anything that comes up for clarification, then we will just open the floor again. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Ghosh.
Thank you very much, Karuna, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you all. So let me not waste more time. Let me go straight ahead into why this topic. I think Karuna already explained it, why it is so important. But we have to remember that this is particularly important in South Asia, and it's a big difference from other countries. So we often think that, developing countries, we're all in the same boat and we have similar responses. But even among developing countries, there are very, very big differences in terms of how many workers are informal and how many are in formal work. I should explain what I mean by informal and formal, because I think it's often not very clear to people. So formal can be divided into two types. There is a formal enterprise, that is the enterprises that are registered, that have, they have part of some list of the government, that they are either more than 50 workers or in 100 workers, depending on which country you're in. And that those enterprises then are subject to regulations. Okay, so they are regulated even in terms of the workers they employ, but also the conditions in that factory or enterprise, various safety procedures, various other procedures. So those are formal enterprises, that those have some kind of regulation. Then there are informal workers. Now, informal workers are a broader category. There are informal workers who work for informal enterprises. In other words, whenever there is an enterprise that is not formal, then all the workers who work in that enterprise are automatically informal. And that includes people who are self-employed. So I think Karuna mentioned people who are selling vegetables on a cart, or people who are doing small services like a barber or a tailor. These are all informal self-employed workers. And then there are informal workers who work for an informal enterprise. But there are also informal workers who work for formal enterprises. And I think that is something we often don't realize. Even, I can show you, even in Delhi, there are factories that have, let us say, half formal workers, and the other half are informal. They are dehari, as we call them, daily wage people, casual people, whom they get for the day or for the week. And they are not actually provided any of the protections that the formal workers are provided. So they don't even figure in the list of the total workers because they're seen as casual. And that kind of informal work is actually growing in India. So in the private sector in India, more than half of the workers are now informal, even in the formal enterprises. So that's a very big, important category. And then the third category are informal workers who work in households, domestic workers, people who work inside the house, cooks, gardeners, cleaners, children, people who look after children, all of that range of domestic work. These are also informal workers, but they work for households. So there are all these many different kinds of informal work. Why does it matter? It matters because typically those who are in formal work, they have some kind of legal protection. That is to say, first of all, it is known that they are working for a particular employer. And then if the government creates certain rules, then those workers will typically be more protected than other workers. So just now, for example, across the world, there are companies that have been given benefits for keeping on workers. This hasn't happened in South Asia, but it has happened in many developing countries and in the England, in UK, in the US, in Japan, in South Korea, in China. That is to say, the companies and the firms that kept on their workers, the workers who were on their payroll, they were given some benefit, some subsidy. But this related only to the formal workers, okay? If you're an informal worker, you're not in that payroll, you're not recognized. And of course, informal enterprises never got that benefit at all, okay? So it's a very big difference. Similarly, you can actually get many other kinds of social security. A formal worker is defined as a worker who has a signed contract, gets some kind of paid leave, and some kind of social security provided by the employer. It could be health insurance, it could be a pension or social security benefit at the end of it, provident fund, etc. Okay. Now, if you don't have any of these, then you are an informal worker, even in a formal enterprise. In India, I have to tell you, 95% of our workers are informal. 95%. Only 5% are formal. So even in formal enterprises, there is a very large number of workers who do not have any of these benefits, who are informal. Okay. I'm not sure what the situation is in Nepal, but I imagine it is also very, very high. So South Asia is different. Now, what does that mean? It means that in something like the pandemic that we have just experienced, or are still experiencing, and most of all in the lockdown, if suddenly you are denied your income because the enterprise is closed, so you're thrown out of your job, or you simply cannot go and work, whether it is a small enterprise or it is domestic work, you're not allowed to go and work. So you do not actually get any income. Whereas if you were a formal enterprise worker and if you had formal rules and regulations, you would be entitled to some benefit even in the period of the lockdown. Consider the situation. I am a formal sector worker. I am teaching in a university. Throughout this period of the lockdown, I have got my salary, my full salary actually. Okay, it's true, I've been taking online classes, but that's not the point. I've got my full salary. Whereas many of the domestic workers who come and work in people's houses in my university campus, they have not been allowed to come. Now, the government said you should please give them your salary, but a survey was done and it was found that only 20% of employers were giving salary to their domestic workers in this period of lockdown. So 80% of domestic workers were not getting their salary in this period. You see what a big difference this is. And this difference is particularly marked in South Asia, even compared to other developing countries. So China, where it first happened, this whole pandemic, and where in Wuhan they had a very major lockdown, most of the people in Wuhan kept getting some income throughout that period of lockdown. That's very different, okay? Same thing in Korea. They did a lockdown, but they continued to give salaries to most people. It's a very, very big difference. And once you recognize that difference, there are two important implications. One, of course, that the condition of these workers becomes terrible, becomes really, really bad. And we will talk about what it has meant in India, what are the implications for it for the livelihood, for conditions, for the kind of treatment that especially migrant workers have got and all of that. But the other implication is a macroeconomic implication. And this, I need to explain it a little carefully because it's quite an important issue and it's not talked about very much. What is the macroeconomic implication? You see, it is what we call in economics, we call it an automatic stabilizer. What does that mean? So, suddenly you're closing down the economy. You're just stopping everything, right? So you're stopping supply, production of many things, but you're also stopping demand. People are not getting money, right? In this period, the ones who are not getting paid, they have no income. They have to live off savings or they have to live off borrowing by taking debt. If, on the other hand, you continue to get your income, you continue to get your wage or your salary, then your demand will not fall to that extent, yes? So the more people continue to get some income, that is called an automatic stabilizer, okay? And what happens is that the more formal your economy is, the more chance you have of an automatic stabilizer. Now, what does that automatic stabilizer do? It maintains demand in the system. So it means the economy does not completely collapse. See, right now, we are not noticing it because the lockdown is still continuing. In India, they're beginning to lift it. Of course, as they lift it, we are seeing an explosion of cases. But still, we have mostly lockdown with some restrictions being lifted. But when the restrictions are fully lifted, that is when we will realize how much the economy is damaged. Because the economy has been very, very badly damaged. The economy has been destroyed by this lockdown. You see, it's not that you can just stop everything and then go away for 2 months and then come back and open the tap again and say, now we carry on as before. It's not like that. It's not a tap that you can turn on and off. Once you have turned that tap off, when you turn it on, even then the water will not flow. Even then, you will have to do something to revive the economy because there is no ability to spend. People will not have any wage incomes to spend. And if they do not have wage incomes to spend, then those who want to produce, there's no point in producing. There is no market to buy those things. So investors will not invest either. So you will actually have a very major contraction of the economy even after you lift the lockdown because of the lockdown. The lockdown itself will create conditions for a further decline of the economy. And the more you have informal workers in your economy, the larger the share of your informal workers, the greater the chance of that economic contraction. So you see why in South Asia, we are in a particularly bad position because we had very severe lockdowns, especially India, lesser extent Pakistan, lesser extent Nepal, but you also had some of the most stringent lockdowns in the world. And we also have a very high proportion of informal workers. So we are actually in a sense, the worst possible situation. We will be forced to lift the lockdown when the disease is the most spreading, when the epidemic is at its peak. We will be forced to lift the lockdown at that time, as is happening in India. And at the same time, even when we lift it, the economy will not recover on its own because so many people will have lost their incomes and not be able to demand goods and services. Okay, this is 15 minutes. I'm just checking if I should stop for some questions or if there's anybody who needs a clarification at this point.
I think it was general introduction, so I don't think there is any question. So you can just move ahead with it if there is anything.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so now let's consider the nature of how this works in the context of this extremely informal economy. One of the problems with the response in India, and I suspect that could also be a problem in the rest of South Asia, again to a lesser extent because yours was not as severe as India, but broadly speaking, there will be similar kinds of responses. One major problem is that we did the whole thing, first of all, very abruptly. In India, we gave 5 hours notice to the entire population. Sorry, 4 hours. 4 hours notice to do closing of the economy, no movement, nobody is allowed to go anywhere, no economic activity, no trains, no buses, nothing, okay, immediately. But also we did it when we had relatively few cases. We actually started a complete and total lockdown at a period when we didn't need to do a total lockdown. We could have instead focused on just the areas where there were more cases and said we will do very comprehensive testing there. We will trace all the people who have come in contact with the positive cases. We will isolate those, we will quarantine those, and we will try and contain the disease that way. In other words, you go for a policy of testing, tracing, isolating, and containment. So you can even create containment zones. This would mean that other places and other activities could continue. You didn't have to close everything. You didn't have to say no transport, no trains, no buses, no economic activity. You didn't have to do all that. You simply had to identify the cases and trace them and isolate them. Okay, at that point. Instead of that, we did a complete lockdown. So we began with the Brahmastra. We began with the most strong kind of weapon that is available. And of course, you cannot sustain that very strong weapon for very long, because you can see it has devastating implications for the economy. So because we had put the strongest instrument first, that destroyed the economy, it also meant that other kinds of disease were not treated. We now have cancer patients who are not getting chemotherapy. We have kidney dialysis people who are not getting dialysis. We have women who are not getting institutional delivery, who are being forced to deliver in homes. We have children who are not being immunized. We have TB patients who are not being treated. So other illnesses have just been allowed to fester, to multiply, to get worse. And of course, that is going to get worse and worse over time as well. Meanwhile, we also destroyed the economy, and that in turn meant that because at least half of our population is already at the margin of subsistence, very soon we got the fact that they were not able to buy food. And because we did not provide enough food to people, we should have, through our public distribution, we should have provided free food, say 10 kilograms per person per month to at least 80% of the population for this 3 to 6 months, but we didn't. And because of that, we have more and more people now on the verge of starvation, because you can use your savings for a while, you can use credit for a while, but after a month you run out, after 5 weeks, 6 weeks you run out. Now this has been 10 weeks. Okay? And so we have more and more people on the verge of starvation, which really means that they are weaker and in a position to succumb to any illness, not just COVID-19, but cholera or some other illness can actually destroy you. So we have a weaker, more enervated population. We have people on the verge of destitution. And then we have the enormous problem of migrants. Now, the term migrants is also a bit of an odd term, because it's a kind of suggestion that they don't belong there somehow. But this is actually a very wrong way of looking at it. So a migrant worker is anyone who has moved to another location just for a job. Okay? And we have them all over the country. We also have them coming from Nepal to India, from different parts of India to rural to rural, rural to urban. We have all kinds, urban to urban. We have all kinds of migrant workers. But usually the migrant workers are among the poorest in any location, because, especially the recent arrivals, because they still yet have to find their feet and establish themselves, get some assets, get some savings. Mostly recent arrivals tend to be among the poorest and engaged in the worst occupations. But these are also the people who build our cities, who provide the essential services, who keep our cities and towns and even our big villages running. They would not survive without the work, the essential work provided by these migrant workers. Now, what happened? You declare in 4 hours that everything is shut. And suddenly, a large part of these workers, in India, we estimate there will be anywhere between 120 and 150 million such workers. Suddenly, they have no income. And this goes on. First, you're told 21 days, then you're told another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks. We are now in the 4th phase of this lockdown. Okay, we've just completed the 4th phase of the lockdown. It's been more than 2 months. It's been nearly 10 weeks. And migrants are desperate. Now, the biggest betrayal is that not only were migrant workers told suddenly that we have the power to deny you any possibility to earn your own living. From tomorrow, you're not allowed to earn your own living. You cannot go to work. That was the first thing. Then they say, well, anyway, we don't know how long it will continue, but in that period, we're not going to help you in any way. Atmanirbhar, you have to depend on yourself. We are not going to provide you any income. We're not going to really provide you even food. We're not really going to look after you. It's up to you to deal with it. No compensation, really. And then the worst betrayal of all, you cannot even go home to your family and try and survive there. We will not help you survive, but you cannot even somehow try and go back to your family to survive. For the first month of the lockdown, it was a crime to try and move, to try and go home. Workers who tried to go home, of course, there were no buses, there were no trains, nothing was running. If they tried to walk, they were attacked on the roads, they were beaten, they were put in detention camps, they were sprayed with dangerous disinfectant chemicals, they were humiliated, terrible treatment to these workers who were just trying to get home. Now, this is a very class-conscious thing, I have to tell you, because the migrants who were abroad, the migrants in China, in Italy, in France, in the US, special planes were arranged to bring them back. So there's a very strong class character to the response even about migrant workers. Those migrants who could have afforded to travel abroad were actually given special treatment with special trains. In the first 1 month, those planes were free for those migrants to come back. Whereas our own internal migrants or migrants from neighboring countries who are providing the bulk of the important essential work that keeps our economies and societies going, they were not only not provided any transport, but they were actually attacked and humiliated and punished if they tried to go home. Now, after about 5 weeks of this, when the situation became really bad and there were actually riots in some towns like Surat and Bombay and Mumbai and so on, finally the government allowed interstate buses. But then they said, we are not, central government will not pay for it. State governments have to pay. In India, the state governments have no money. So it was really difficult for them and very few buses were organized. And then it was not enough. And then there were arguments about who will pay for it, the state of the destination, the state of the origin, all of these kinds of issues came up. Finally, again, trains were set up. Again, with the trains, the same kind of issue. Who is going to pay for it? The central government did not pay for it. They claim they paid, but actually they have not provided any money. The migrants themselves were made to pay for these tickets. This is after they have already spent 2 months at near starvation levels, when they have used up all their savings, when they have no money left. Then you are made to pay full price for a ticket to go back to your home. That too, not to your full home, to some train station near your home, and from there you can walk or do whatever you can. So the kinds of ill treatment that we have given to migrant workers, I think it's unbelievable. I cannot imagine that we could have done this in a civilized democratic society, but we have done it. There's a very strong class angle to it. I would say there's also a very strong caste angle to it. Because again, many of these migrant workers come from particular castes, so-called lower castes, and they were routinely humiliated throughout this process. There is, I noticed that Karuna has pointed out that the same thing has happened in Nepal about chartered planes. Exactly. So the class character of this attitude towards migrants, the ones who are abroad get special treatment, the ones inside actually get punishment. Now, this kind of betrayal will have significant implications. It doesn't go forgotten. So now, in fact, migrants will think twice. These workers would think twice before going back to a place where they were given such a complete betrayal, where overnight you can lose everything, and then you can be punished for trying to go home. This is a very, very serious thing. It's not something you can just treat lightly. It's not something that you can say, well, never mind, we'll just go back and work again. So there is a real possibility that it will be hard to get workers to come back unless you actually have better conditions, much more security, better labor contracts, more promises that you will be treated better, all of these kinds of concerns. Yeah? So far, we are not seeing that, but I think we will need to be fighting for that, because otherwise these cities and towns and even the agricultural areas where harvesting is very important, they are all going to find that they are not going to be able to get workers when they need it. There's one other angle that I just want to mention in terms of the cross-cutting inequalities. I've talked to you about how this is a class issue, but it's also a caste issue. It is also a gender issue. This lockdown in India, and I'm pretty sure it was also true in Nepal, has been incredibly gender insensitive. Okay, there have been all kinds of ways in which the complete lack of thought of the special problems of women has been an underlying and continuous feature of the way the policy response has been. The lockdown itself, it forces people into homes and that they're stuck in their homes and they don't have income. Now, this is a recipe for frustration, anger, resentment. And of course, a lot of that gets taken out inside the home. We've had many, many reports. We've had a doubling and a tripling of reports of domestic violence to the National Commission of Women and the State Commission of Women. But these are all underestimates, because many social workers have said that most of the women are scared to lodge complaints, because even lodging a complaint can put you in trouble. You're still trapped at home with the person who is beating you up. You can't go anywhere. And so it's actually very dangerous even to lodge a complaint. So we have seen a very significant increase in violence against women and almost impossible ability to do something about it for the women who are facing this. Also because there is all the shelters that were there for women have also been closed in this period. You know, there are not enough, but there are some shelters for women facing domestic violence. In India, most of these were closed over the lockdown rather than kept open because you need them more. Okay? Many other ways in which there was gender insensitivity. When the list of essential items that have to be produced and distributed was provided, the original list didn't even contain menstrual pads for women, as if that is not an essential item. And it was only after 1 week and a lot of complaints and the noise that finally they included it in the list. But in the meantime, the shortages were created. There were many other ways in which women particularly have been affected by the policy response. And remember that women are the frontline workers. They are the nurses, they are the ASHA, the health workers. They are the sanitation workers who are right at the front of dealing with this disease. And yet most of the time they are not paid properly. They are not provided a safe protective equipment. They're not even given overtime. In many states of India, because the states, as I told you, have no money, they haven't even been paid for the last month. Their wage payments have been delayed. And so we are talking about really bad situations for the frontline women workers who are absolutely at the forefront of dealing with this disease. Okay, Nikesh is asking, yes, and Karuna, you're absolutely right that it is gendered, but it is the poor women in particular. The cross-cuttingness of it is absolutely. In India, it is also the case that it is the lower caste women who are the sanitation workers. And the sanitation workers are absolutely the worst affected, the absolute forefront of the problem. Okay, Nikesh is asking, can we say that this is also because of the quantity and infrastructure arrangement? For example, Nepalis in India and Middle East, both are workers. They are also differently treated. How can we interpret it on a class basis? Yeah, this is a very complicated issue. So you see, there are different things. One is that in the Middle East, migrant workers from abroad, it's a much more regimented system. You know, there are very strong rules and it's much more clear and established. So it's true that quite often they are discriminated against in those societies. But on the other hand, they are also treated along certain lines and those rules are pretty much followed. So in a way, it's kind of regulated. In India, as you can see, there is no regulation of anything. And labor market regulation almost doesn't exist. Very tiny proportion, 5% are formal workers. Even among the formal workers, you can't always benefit from those labor market laws. But 95% of the workers have got no benefit, no protection, legal or social. Okay. So in India, the fact that Nepali workers in India are treated differently is also because Indian workers in India are treated differently also, if you see what I mean. It's a reflection of the fact that in India, we treat all workers badly. And then among that, the migrant workers, whether from inside India or from outside India, are treated particularly badly. So that Bihari workers in Tamil Nadu are treated badly. Also, they can't speak the language, they cannot fight for their rights, they can't get together, etc. Odia workers in Maharashtra are treated badly. Okay, domestic workers from Jharkhand who are all over the country are treated badly, worse than even other informal workers. So migrant workers in general are treated worse than local workers. But I won't say that it's because they're from Nepal. I mean, I would say that across India, the same thing is true. It is equivalently bad across for migrant workers across the country. Sulav is asking, okay, he says, it's a bleak picture. Now we have destroyed our economy. It will inevitably impact on other sectors. So in worst case scenario, can you see disturbances in security situations and possible outbreak of civil wars, civil disobedience maybe? I think civil disobedience would be the best option. That's the Gandhian way. Peaceful civil disobedience is the best way to make government serious. And that would be the best option. I wish it were that. I think it is very bleak. Because you see, also what I have described to you is that even after the pandemic is over, after we can lift all the restrictions, even then, the economy will be in such a bad state that there will be a real decline in the bargaining power of the working class. And that is going to lead to very bad conditions. We may not even see a floor to wages. We may see terrible oppression, terrible. Already in India, some state governments tried to lift labor laws, because they said there's no point now, employers will not be interested unless we lift the labor laws and allow them complete freedom to exploit labor. So already all of that has started. So yes, things are going to get very bad. I see worsening security situations in India. Of course, the ruling government will try and fan communal riots, religious divisions, because that is what they know. They are very good at that. They're used to that. That's what they would try and do. But we are already seeing evidence of food riots. Grain that is being transported on trains, when it's being loaded, people have gone and just, broken the barricades and gone and collected what they can. They have looted because they're starving. We're going to see more and more of that. We are seeing more and more petty crime on the streets in Delhi, in Mumbai, and all the big cities, because again, people are starving. They're desperate. And so, yes, all of that, unfortunately, will happen. What we need to do as progressives, we need to think of how to channel all of this unhappiness, anger, frustration, resentment into positive directions, into directions that force the government to change its policies. I think that's our challenge today. Caste, but of which class? Gender, but which class? I think, as I mentioned, it is very much an issue of cross-cutting inequalities. There is a class dimension, there is a caste dimension, there is a gender dimension. And absolutely, the bottom, the worst off, the most oppressed, the most exploited, and the most affected by this current situation are those where all those cross-cutting inequalities meet. That doesn't mean that there's no impact on other castes or none of that, but that these are cross-cutting inequalities. Is Corona's good impact upon agriculture aspect? Is it most of people's concept towards field instead of market selling goods? I don't think so. I'm not so convinced that that this is going to have a positive impact on, let's say, more self-sufficiency and so on. Again, it depends on the policy response. What we need is actually much more policy orientation towards making rural economies viable, which means that it's not just enough to promote agriculture, to enable agriculture, but we have to promote it. So what has the government said? It said, yes, you can do farming, it's allowed. But permitting it is not good enough. You have to enable it, you have to incentivize it, you have to make sure that farmers have inputs, you have to make sure they get good prices, you have to make sure they get decent credit, you have to make sure they can distribute the goods. All of that has to be done with active intervention by the government. but also you have to enable rural enterprises to grow. This is a very good moment when so many migrants have gone back to the villages. This is a very good moment to promote village enterprises, to promote and encourage and incentivize small-scale enterprises that can cater to the local economy, provide goods and services for the local economy. And for that, we need to have proactive government policies. It's not just enough to say we allow it. You really have to encourage it and enable it. Okay. Vijay Kumar Podel is saying, it is my own judgment that these types of lockdown modalities applied by the governments of Nepal and India, let me just see the rest of the question, are more against poor people. Absolutely, I completely agree. These are dominantly against poor people. And, you know, there are two ways of interpreting it. One way is to say that they were just not thinking. They were just copying blindly what they saw in China and in developed countries. But there's another way of thinking that they actually wanted a lockdown, at least in India, they wanted a lockdown to suppress dissent. You know, in the 6 months before the lockdown, before the pandemic, there was an explosion of protest, peaceful protest across the country. And they really did not know how to handle it. So a completely enforced physical lockdown was a wonderful way to solve the problem. You use the disease to actually just force people into their homes, get rid of all the dissent. But you don't do anything about the disease. You don't increase public health spending. You don't make sure you get enough testing kits. You don't increase the hospital beds. You don't do any of the things you're supposed to do during the lockdown. You just close everything down, because that enables you to suppress democratic voices. Unfortunately, in India, that is how it's been used, because the entire period of the lockdown has been wasted. We didn't do the kinds of things that were necessary to ensure that once we started opening up, we could deal with the problem. And so as a result, even with the slight opening up, which we've had for the last week, we have seen an explosion of cases. It's gone completely crazy. In the city of Delhi, every day, there are thousands and thousands of cases. The hospitals are full. People are not being let into hospitals. People are dying outside. Nobody is being tested. If someone dies of COVID, even the family is not tested. We are in a crazy situation now in the big cities, because we did not use that lockdown time to prepare. And that is the central government's fault, because they have the money. The state governments do not have the resources to do this. Absolutely, Jeevan Acharya has pointed out that women with disability are more at risk. I am sorry, I forgot to mention the other cross-cutting inequality of disability. And it's a very, very important point, Jeevan, so thank you so much for mentioning it. Women, and also all people with disability, are particularly at risk. 12% of the population of South Asia has got some disability. 12%, that's a very large proportion. 1 in 10 people has got some disability. And we have absolutely no facilities for them, no infrastructure, no amenities. The lockdown measures do not make any special kinds of, ways of dealing with their specific problems. And it makes it harder for them to access even the basic kinds of things that they would need to survive in a critical period like this. Women in particular, women single-headed women-headed households, definitely also very, very vulnerable. But in terms of cross-cutting inequalities, the disabilities is a very, very important angle as well. Okay, Santosh is asking, Santosh Podel, what can be the... Yes?
Jayati, I think we can keep that question for the this is, I think, the main that you would be coming up with what could be our step. So before you answer to that, I think I would like to, because informal sector, we were also having a discussion 2 days back on the informal trade and the workers in the border. For example, I don't know if you know about this. We were talking about Rajnigandha, the people use that. And it's I was saying it's a luxury, not a essential item. But then these are carried by very low level, lower class people, and they're carried cross-border in informal way. So, even if the lockdown eases, the borders are not going to be open soon. So what would be the impact? How do you see this issue? Because in context of Nepal and India, we have this open borders, and there is huge, there are a large number of people who are trading informally. So how do you see their issues? Before we go on to take that question, I would like to hear from you.
Yeah. You know, I think there is a real concern about this, and it is unlikely that the border is going to be open soon. Let's be clear, the pandemic is just on an upward curve in India. I don't know when we will see the peak, certainly not before July, maybe even August. So we are on a situation of rising cases. I'm not even sure that the easing of restrictions that we've seen in the last week will be sustained. Maybe they will again pose restrictions. Certainly the borders are not going to be opened up. And that really means that all of this kind of informal trade is very, very badly affected. It's not going to be better off. And it's going to be a devastation in terms of livelihoods. And of course, for those who are addicted to Rajnigandha, that is going to get also a serious problem. But yes, that is something which you have to reckon with, that for the next few months, these borders are likely to remain closed, and all of those whose livelihood depended on that informal trade are going to be massively affected. That's without question. So what are the possible steps to address? I'm going to look at that at the end, because I'm going to talk about what we can do. Yeah. Can we say the lockdown is against poor and migrant workers? Absolutely. I think I've already answered that. Why are governments not accepting their responsibility? Because they never do. Governments always try and avoid the responsibility. It's up to us, the people, to force them. That's why they also like to prolong lockdowns, because as long as there's a lockdown, you can't even get a lot of public protest. We have to think of ways to make that point to governments, even in a situation of lockdown.
Just to add, Jayati, add on to that, I mean, for India, we can say that, okay, there is very rightist kind of government, very fundamentalist, but in context of Nepal, we claim that we have 2/3 majority left government, like it's a Communist Party of Nepal is in the rule, and still we are facing this situation that it's really a tragedy.
I think that's all the more reason, at least you have the option of making that voice heard and reminding them that this is why they were elected. And I think that way you're in a better position. We are in a situation where we have a government that really doesn't care and has more or less openly said that they don't care. So at least you have the possibility of forcing different policies on your government, which I will come to. Do we need to extend the lockdown? No. Extending the lockdown will be, as I said, just devastating for livelihoods. And it hasn't done anything. It hasn't helped people. It hasn't, you know, what we should have done in the very beginning is what I said: testing, tracing, isolation, containment. Even now, that is what we should do. It's true, we have got into a phase of community transmission, but there is no point in just doing a lockdown, because then people are going to die of other things, you know, of just hunger and other diseases rather than of COVID-19. So we really have to think of other measures. The economic view is this epidemic is going to create genocide, isn't it? Yes, unfortunately, it's a kind of economic genocide that we are seeing. The treatment of the Indian government has both class and character. What do you think about the witch hunt of Tablighi Jamaat by Indian mainstream media and the state itself? Absolutely. I think I mentioned this. We are possibly the only country in the world that has managed to communalize the virus, give the virus itself a religious character. The attempt in the early days of the lockdown was to blame the entire thing on one particular gathering of Muslims, which was held in Delhi. But you know, it's just unlucky that that particular gathering had some COVID-19 positive people. On the very same days when this lockdown was being held, so when that event, the Tablighi Jamaat event was being held, there were many gatherings across the country of Hindu groups. There was a large gathering in Ayodhya attended by the Chief Minister of UP for beginning work on the Ram temple. There was a big gathering in Madhya Pradesh when they were trying to topple the Madhya Pradesh government, and they succeeded and they installed a BJP government. They had thousands of people gather. So it's just that they were lucky that they did not actually have COVID positive people in that gathering. But ever since then, they have tried to use that to criminalize Muslims who get ill. And this because the media has been pushing it so systematically. The mainstream media is beyond appalling. It is criminal because they have been pushing it so systematically now. There's a whole attitude that any Muslim person who has this disease, they deserve to have it because they attended that gathering and they've done terrible things and we should, I mean, it's terrible. What has been happening is beyond any civilized kind of discourse. Okay. Netra Bhandari is saying, I feel that our South Asian culture, including India and China, cannot be redefined the different in class of people depending on their personal, social, and economic development. Rather, I feel that our leadership are doing politics in the name of caste and race, though they frequently cite socialism. What do you suggest on it and the provision of racial and caste reservation in the Constitution? This is a very complicated issue. Okay, now I cannot speak for Nepal because I do believe it's a different kind of government, as Karuna also mentioned. It's not the same as in India. Okay, and I don't think that caste and religion and caste are only in the minds of the leadership. Unfortunately, they have also managed to poison society. Caste is a very, very old problem in India, and it hasn't gone away. Even when they pretend, the upper castes pretend it doesn't exist, they nonetheless maintain caste discrimination in all kinds of ways. Religious discrimination, society has been poisoned over the last 20 years, really systematically poisoned by political groups, by right-wing groups that have created all these divisions within people. And so it's not so easy. We really have to work. We can't just say it's at the top. It is at the top, but it has permeated all the way down. So we have to address it holistically. We have to recognize that there are all these terrible forms of discrimination and exclusion that we have to address and challenge at every level. It's not only at the top. Okay. Narayan Khanal is saying globalization is the main reason for spread of COVID-19. Could we conclude that it is the natural threat to human beings against the building superpower and support for building local independent economy and decentralization of resources and power? Yeah, this is a complicated one. Yes, it's absolutely true. Globalization, I mean, COVID-19 spread because people were moving so quickly around the world. If we think this is a threat, we are still dealing with the even greater existential threat of climate change. Remember, and Nepal is very vulnerable also. We are going to get many more climate disasters. Apparently, Delhi, a major earthquake is brewing. We are in an earthquake zone, and the other kinds of rumblings suggest a very, very major earthquake is likely in the near future. We are facing very many disasters. Is this nature's way of saying that we as humanity have overstepped our limits? Probably. I think there's a very strong element of that. How do we address that? Do we say, well, okay, fine, we just have to deal with it? Or do we change our model, our economic model, how we construct our societies and economies? Do not obsess about GDP. Do not obsess only about creating larger and larger markets, but think first of ensuring sustainable basic needs for all people and improving the quality of life rather than the quantity of things. I think that is the critical thing that we have to look at. And for that, we really need to think, not just in terms of local and decentralized, but entirely different ways of producing and consuming and distributing, and valuing the things that improve the quality of life, rather than, as I said, quantities of things. Aruna Parajuli is asking, have I analyzed the food security situation of the country now and in a few months? So, you know, in India, we actually have at the moment, in the aggregate, we have a surplus of food. The Indian government is sitting on about 87 million tons of food grain stocks when it needs to hold only 24 million as buffer stock. So 60 million tons extra. Now, many of us have been demanding for the last 2 months, for heaven's sake, distribute the food grain stock to the hungry. If not now, then when? Why are you keeping a buffer stock? You've already got a buffer stock, you're keeping 3 times that amount extra. Distribute 10 kilograms free to every person. For 1 month, 10 kilograms, distribute free for 6 months. Only about 80% of the population will take it, and that 80% needs it. It will prevent hunger, it will prevent starvation, it will allow them to spend on other things that they need. And you will actually save money, because at the moment you're storing this food grain, that's costing you money. You will save the storage money. So we have been saying that this is a time when the government should actually distribute this food grain free. In the aggregate, we have food sovereignty right now, but we do not have food security because people do not have the money to buy food. And the government is hoarding these food stocks, even allowing them to rot in the godowns, rather than distributing them free to the people. That speaks to the class character of this government, of course, but it also speaks to the fact that even in a democracy, we are not able to force the government to do this most obvious thing, which they should be doing. Okay, Sagar is asking, as you said, lower caste labor are routinely humiliated. Can you explain about the form of caste-based exploitation in the modern economic system in our context? This is a very big issue. I wouldn't have time to talk about all of it, but I have written articles before which have argued that in the Indian case, our development is based on caste exploitation and gender exploitation. Even the boom of the 2000s was one that was based on the segmented labor markets that are created by caste and gender. So we cannot separate our trajectory of economic growth from these caste and gender forms of exploitation in particular. Netra, okay, what do I suggest in terms of, I've talked about that. Regular economic and social and educational activity should be started. Yes, we have to revive the economy, but for that we have to revive demand in the system. Ramesh Paudel, in general, the negative impact of natural calamities and any sort of economic shocks are high to the lower class people in developing countries. Migrant workers in the destination belong to the same class and are in a state more vulnerable. Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And everything I said conforms to that. Santosh Pariyar asks, do I see any possibility from the government side to cope with the possible future condition of people's lives? And what can you suggest to make government more responsible? Yes, I will come to that. And many questions on the alternatives. Sambal Jolagan is asking about what are the alternatives for starting informal enterprises. Buddhanath Sharma is asking a broader question. Have women, workers, caste, class that we're talking about ever been treated with dignity by the administrations and the elite? Hasn't the corona crisis merely brought out to public the deplorable and undignified lives of the working class all across the world? Hasn't it exposed a system which only cares for the elite? Yes, of course, that's true. But it has brought it out much sharper and it's made it worse. It's actually not just the same. It is significantly worse now. So this is a situation, therefore, where the response measures have to be even more extreme. It's not enough to say, yes, this is bad and it's always been bad. We have to say it is now even worse. And so we need policy responses that recognize that it is now even worse. Okay, are governments across the world doing politics in the name of COVID-19? Absolutely, yes. What are the challenges I see afterwards? I'll come to that. I'm just looking at all the questions and then I will give some closing answers to all of them because I think it's already a long time. The public health system. Sudeep Shrestha is asking, Corona has exposed the public health system in countries like India and Nepal. And informal sector labor are mostly affected. However, in Kerala, absolutely correct, but the left state government is doing good, setting an example. How can the neoliberal government policy in India and Nepal fight against this? What is the left alternative? Yes. Refer to possible steps for local institutions. Yes. Okay, I think most of the questions are therefore really about the alternative. And since there are many, many more questions, I think I'm going to really talk about the alternative.
Yeah. Just to let you know that I think this way is also the question that could be at the end. We are going live on Facebook and there is a question from Promise Patel. He used to be my teacher and he is also currently professor. He says that how can youth be mobilized more productively in this pandemic?
Okay.
I think you can keep it for the last.
Well, I'm going to now talk about the alternatives. So I'm now going to take up all the questions that are relating to the alternative. And by the way, I agree with Vijay Kumar Podel also that bourgeois governments are using COVID to hide their weaknesses and failures. It's come really like a heaven-sent opportunity to them, unfortunately. And they are using it in every possible way. Now, what do we do? How do we deal with this? How would a responsible government deal with this? Or if I could imagine a dream world where, let's say, the Chief Minister of Kerala, Pinarayi Vijayan, was actually the Prime Minister of the country, what would I ask him to do? So there are a few things that have to be done immediately. One, I mentioned already, providing free food grain to everybody who asks for it, 10 kilograms per person. And we are estimating about 80% of the population would take it for 6 months. Okay, because there is a genuine problem of hunger. We are going to see famine, we're going to see food riots, things are going to get much, much worse if we don't do this. Second, provide some incomes as compensation for the income losses that people have experienced. We have suggested something like 7,500 rupees per household. Again, for across the board, not only people who are taking a rural employment guarantee and all that, but in general, across the board, for 3 months only. And this is 3 months as compensation, because they did not choose to stay in their homes. The government has forced them. The government lockdown prevented them from earning their living. The government has to compensate. So this is really like a compensatory income. It is not a charity. It is not being kind to the poor. This is a compensation due to working people who were not allowed to work. Third, in India, we have the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which provides 100 days employment to every rural household. Actually, it has never really provided full 100 days. It's usually provided about 40, 50 days, but the law enables it to provide 100 days. We are saying, change the law to make it 200 days of employment to every adult, not just per household, 200 days of employment to every adult at the minimum wage. And then expand the nature of the works. At the moment, it's mostly earthwork, construction work around villages, very arduous manual labor. Expand the nature of the work. Include even small, medium, and micro enterprises, and give a wage subsidy to those enterprises by allowing people to work on those enterprises, where you pay the MNREJ wage and then the employer pays the additional amount. That will enable even these micro enterprises to survive. Otherwise, we are going to see a complete collapse of even these MSMEs. And they are the biggest employers in our country. So expand the rural employment guarantee massively, allow it to happen in all kinds of other activities, because it sets a wage floor and it allows people to work for a living. Similarly, extend the act to urban areas. Create an urban employment guarantee, again at the minimum wage, and again for every adult, not household based. And use that to provide basic services in urban areas, including care services, which are completely underprovided at the moment. Care services for elderly, for disabled, for those affected by COVID-19, for volunteers to deliver things, goods to people who cannot go out of their homes, who are in containment and etc. Provide all kinds of activities to help in the greening of cities, to make them more environmentally viable and stable, to shift towards more, less climate adverse kinds of scenarios, to cope with natural disasters, to cope with other kinds of impact, to reduce carbon emissions. There are many, many activities that can be done, even in urban areas. In that, we are suggesting, and this ties in with the issue of the youth. You see, one of the ways in which this pandemic has been such a disaster is that it has really destroyed the economic prospects of a generation. How do we actually compensate that? And one of the ways is to have this employment guarantee, which will provide everybody access to something at minimum wage, but also include a skill component in that. Include some training, include some skilled work. And that is especially feasible, not just in urban areas, but even in rural areas. If you expand it to include care work as well, okay? So we are saying expand and enable skilling to happen through these employment guarantee programs, which will also provide a skill to youth and which will also enable them in the future to actually develop on those activities and occupations. These are all activities that therefore are oriented towards the informal sector. Of course, ideally, it is best to formalize the workforce, to give them labor protection. Because what does informal mean? It only means you have no protection. No legal protection, no social protection. Ideally, we should give more and more workers legal and social protection. We should formalize them. But right now, the tendency is the opposite. The tendency is to get more and more informal, and it will get even worse after the pandemic. We need to counter that by making the informal enterprises and the workers in informal activities more viable, provide demand, put money in their hands for them to be able to demand goods and services, and then ensure that the essential goods and services that they will demand will also be supplied. So for that also we need a planning framework. So essentially there are a number of major recommendations that come out of this. Significant increase in government spending, very, very large, like doubling, especially in the areas that matter for the poor and the working people. So food, employment, cash transfer for these 3 months immediately. Over time, public investments to deal with the climate challenge, public investments to deal with income inequality, more care services, more basic services that enhance the quality of life. Okay. Now, these in turn, how do we fund them? Everybody will turn around and say, we don't have money, where is the money? Immediately, the only option is to borrow from the central bank, what they call the monetized deficit. That's the only option. Right now, you can't raise taxes. Nobody has money to pay taxes in the first place. So right now, you have to borrow from the central bank. And you can do it without being inflationary because demand is plummeting right now. So you will not create inflation by actually printing money right now. But it is true that by next year, you will have to start paying for all of this. And there it's very important to tax the rich, the wealthy. To institute a wealth tax, in India, we have estimated that a 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of the population and an inheritance tax of 30% on the top 1% of the population will give you as much as 10% of GDP. Maybe a bit less now because the wealth indicators have fallen a bit. But that's a lot. You can do so much with that. Yeah? I don't know what the figures are for Nepal, but because there is inequality even in Nepal, a wealth tax would provide some room. Also, it is important to tax multinationals. You know, at the moment, which are the companies that have really done well? ICT companies. All your Google, Amazon, Zoom, the thing that we're using right now, all of these companies have actually massively increased sales and profits. So the only big beneficiaries, corporate beneficiaries of this are in fact these companies. But they are getting away with paying almost no tax because they don't get taxed according to how many people use their services in any one country. They can shift their profits to different countries where there are low taxes. So Amazon pays hardly any taxes. Facebook pays hardly any taxes in India. They shift all their profits to low tax jurisdictions like Ireland or Delaware or somewhere. And they claim that all the profits are being made there. Now, this is nonsense. What we need is to treat multinational companies as unitary, as one company in the globe, and then say, so much percent of your share profits are being made in my country. Your sales, your total sales are this much. That means I am going to tax you. Let's say I account for 5% of your total sales in my country. I'm going to tax you on that 5% of your total sales at my tax rate, 25% or whatever. If enough large countries do that, then the multinationals will have no interest in shifting around their profits. And it will mean that they will be paying taxes like any other company. At the moment, domestic companies have to pay taxes. Multinational companies don't. They can shift their profits around. Why should we allow this? If we do this in India, for example, we'll get another 2% of GDP. So it's actually something that would provide a lot of money. And the other existing system is completely unfair. It makes no sense, actually. So we really need to raise money also through multinational taxation. So it is possible. If you have the political will, you can definitely do it. The other very important thing that we need to do for the medium term is to decentralize in countries like India. I don't know whether in Nepal it comes to the same thing, but I think a decentralized option is the best in all circumstances. So first of all, there must be greater decentralization to the states. to state governments. And then the state of Kerala, somebody mentioned it, already or has shown that it is possible to respond differently. If you have a progressive government that is responsive and aware of the needs of the people, it is possible to do things differently. So in Kerala, there is a big emphasis also on decentralized and community participation, even in response to the pandemic. In Kerala, they have actually asked the local communities, the municipalities, the panchayats, to actually develop specific responses that suit their local areas. We need to devolve more funds to the state governments, and we need then to have the state governments devolve more to the panchayats for these responses. But of course, these responses have to be coordinated. It can't be that, they will set up borders within each other and that kind of thing. They have to be coordinated. And the role the central government should play is that of coordination. Unfortunately, in India, we have got centralization without coordination. And that never works. That actually works in the opposite way. But the state of Kerala has shown that it is possible to base a successful pandemic response on community participation, on involvement of the people, and a responsive government that actually recognizes what the problems are and then goes to try and solve them by talking to the people continuously. Okay, I think that's already, I've possibly gone beyond my allotted time, but let me stop here. Let me just take up some of these. Sudeep Shrestha has said the COVID situation has aggravated the world economy more than the 1930s crisis. That's absolutely true. Supply and demand both have been affected. The Keynesian solution to increase effective demand is also not working properly. Then what should be the Marxist economic policy in this situation? So let me make this clear. The Keynesian solution hasn't even really been fully tried, okay? But you are absolutely right that it won't be enough. It has to be done. You have to increase demand. You can't say, I won't increase demand. Governments have to put money in the hands of people who will spend it. Okay, so you have to have that increase in aggregate demand through Keynesian spending policies. But you also need to increase supply of essentials. And that means you have to bring back another word that was lost in the last 20, 30 years, planning. You have to bring back planning. We need to coordinate. When I was talking about the coordination of policies, you can't do that without planning. When you want to increase supply, you want to make sure that the supply of essentials doesn't run out. So you have to identify essentials. You have to find out what inputs they need. You have to find out what are the distribution channels. So all of that requires planning. It doesn't happen on its own. Planning has to come back to the macroeconomic framework of governments if they are to survive this ordeal and to survive, as I said, the existential challenge of climate change, which is also going to be upon us very, very soon. Is this an opportunity to strengthen the national self-reliant economy? Yes, I think so. But remember that self-reliance can mean many different things. And it's not ever the case that a country like Nepal can be completely self-reliant. You will always need to import certain things. So therefore, you will also need to export other things. You will rather need to develop a self-reliance in terms of the basics, in terms of minimal economic necessities. And that self-reliance does not mean that you leave people to fend for themselves. The way Atmanirbhar is being used in India today, it's basically that the people are left to fend for themselves, the government is not going to do anything for them. That is not the meaning of self-reliance. Self-reliance means that you will promote local activities and local consumption as far as possible, and promote the demand from local communities, which will then generate more input and output linkages. But you will also ensure that you are able to export enough to meet the imports that you need. So it doesn't mean that you're going to avoid trade. It doesn't mean that you're going to say we'll close our borders. It should not mean those things. It should mean that you will enable local communities to actually produce and consume a lot of goods and services among themselves, but also that they will be able to access whatever they need.
So, Jayati, there is one question, I think this is also in my mind. Ashish Kimiri asks that, what do you suggest, either to retain the informal sector as it is, or this needs some other transformation in the economic system, like, bringing it to the formal sector, taxation, and there are many issues to address it. So what are your ideas? What would you suggest?
So, when you look at the history of formality in the developed world, it didn't happen just like that. It happened over centuries as the economies developed and evolved. And there are two different things. One is formalizing enterprises and the other is formalizing labor. Formalizing enterprises is, as you mentioned, to get more tax revenue out of them, basically. Okay, and governments are very keen on formalizing enterprises, but they are not so keen on formalizing labor. Our concern should be to formalize labor, to make sure that labor has got legal protection, social protection. That doesn't happen from the top. That happens when there is widespread mobilization, social and political mobilization for these things. So the kind of labor laws that we now see in Europe and the US and Canada and so on, they happened through decades of struggle from the working classes. The protection, the 8-hour day, it was a very, very long demand. It took decades of fight to get the 8-hour day, which is now thought to be undermined in India. A century of struggle gave us the 8-hour day. Maternity benefits for women, a century of struggle. Okay, all the labor rights that we talk about, these come from struggle. So it's not something that we sit and decide and say, oh, the government should formalize. It doesn't work that way. Formalizing labor is really the outcome of very prolonged class struggle. And we have to recognize that labor rights don't just come, they're not given by governments, because governments typically represent the interests of the dominant classes of capital. We will formalize labor when we ensure that capital and the state have no choice but to listen to the demands of labor. Okay. Uttanath Sharma says something about immediate responses in the long run. What should be the direction of actions of progressive-minded people in terms of establishing a pro-working class economy? I don't think the return to normalcy will change even after these immediate responses, which are properly implemented, will change the nature of our economy, which craves for maximum profit. Yes, absolutely. We're still in capitalist economies, and capitalist economies are all about profit. And of course, we need to change that. And that's why we have to do medium-term and immediate responses, which actually give strength to the working class. That's why all the measures that I've suggested are measures designed to shore up the incomes of farmers and the working class, to ensure that they have enough to survive, because only from that will you get sufficient mobilization to change their bargaining power. So we cannot get a new, different, progressive, green, equitable, gender-sensitive economy unless we begin by creating those conditions, which means the immediate responses have to also be directed towards ensuring the incomes and the livelihoods of the poor and reducing all those cross-cutting inequalities that I was talking about.
So, Jayati, I think if I missed, so we have a question from Vijay Kumar Paudel. So, do you think that the bourgeois governments all over the world are doing politics in the name of COVID-19?
That I answered already.
Yeah. So, what is your view about what is the alternative to this neoliberal economy? What is the alternative to it?
That I've already talked about. I've said the kind of economy that I painted, that economy you will not get in a neoliberal world. In the neoliberal world, you will get a government that is trying to cut its own spending, that refuses to tax the rich, that refuses to tax large corporations, and that denies working people, whether in agriculture or in non-agriculture, their rights. Okay. What I'm suggesting, the policies that I'm suggesting are in fact in the opposite direction. They are policies designed to ensure minimum incomes to people, to ensure minimum wages and decent work conditions to people through public employment in the first instance. And then using the fact that once you have that, you will be able to actually fight for your rights better, to get better and more legal and social protection for workers over time. And that, of course, we have to do along with very, very big increases in public investment, because we are going to cope with huge environmental challenges in South Asia, very, very big challenges of natural disasters, of climate change, and of many other things. So we need that combination.
more question, or do you have? I mean, there is like you getting the thank you note from Vijay Kumar Paudel. Actually, I just want to quickly introduce him. He is former MP, and he is also leader of Communist Party of Nepal. I'm glad that he's really taking time. I know he's very busy, and listening to it, I know definitely when there will be central committee member of the our party, I think you would raise that issue. So before we say thank you to you, I think if you have some final notes, and after this I would like to ask or request our president, Dr. Khagendra Prasad, to just give a vote of thanks to Jayati before we say goodbye to her.
Okay, thank you. And there are two more questions that I have just seen, so I will finally answer these. And I would like to thank Vijay Kumar Paudel for attending this. It's very, very nice of him. So Mani Kumar is asking about if all informal labor should be formalized, but why? If we formalize, what benefits will they get? So let me explain what formalizing means. Formalizing only means that you get minimum labor protection, that you cannot be thrown out for no reason, that you have to get minimum wages, that you have to get some kind of health insurance, that you have to be allowed 1 day's leave every week, that you have to be allowed some leave every month or every year, that you have to be allowed, that you have to have a written contract that specifies that you actually are working. These are not big things to ask. So formalizing work is just simply ensuring that workers get some minimum protection. That's all it is. It's nothing more than that. What are the chances? Himanshu Kimiri is asking, how high are the chances of discontented working class getting swayed by fascist or right-wing power after this pandemic? Unfortunately, very high. I think we should not pretend otherwise. We can see it happening in India already. They've already been swayed by very right-wing forces, and we are going to see possibly more of that. The attempt of the ruling class will definitely be to divert people's attention, to start making them, blame Muslims or blame from their own failures, to make sure that their conditions are so desperate that they're only concerned about somehow surviving rather than protesting and demanding their rights. That will definitely be the attempt, and yes, they could well be successful. We have to recognize that challenge. But it is also the case that the kinds of massive betrayal that we have seen of the working class, I've described the extent of that betrayal. I don't think I have seen this kind of betrayal in my lifetime. Somebody was saying, no, that always capitalism is doing this. It's always exploiting women and workers and low caste. That's true. But this open, excessive, extreme betrayal, I have not seen. It's so open and out there that it's very hard to pretend that it's something else. And I think that helps in concentrating people's minds. I think that helps them see things, reality, in a kind of sharper way. It's a very unpleasant reality to see. But when you see that unpleasant reality, you are more willing to consider alternatives, I think. So while it is a very dangerous time, and it's a terrible time, there's no doubt about it, and the working class will definitely come out of this with reduced bargaining power, nonetheless, it is a time, it's a churning, which will generate recognition of how terrible this particular system is and why we have to think of alternatives.
Sure.
Okay, I think that I have finally said enough, and I'm sorry if I've gone on a bit too long.
No, it's all right. I mean, before I give I ask Dr. Khagendra Prasad to say something. I'm really happy that we have a lot of activists who have joined us in this webinar. I can also see the thank you note from writer Tulsidas Moharjan there, and we have other party leaders, university students. I think we have a wide variety of background, and I'm really happy that we could share about it, because still talking about informal sector has not been so widely discussed in Nepal. So I'm glad that we're taking this initiative, and I would like to thank you from my side, and I think I would like to ask or request Dr. Khagendra Prasad to give thank you note.
Thank you, Karuna. Let me artfully congratulate and thank Dr. Ghosh for her informed, analytical, and critical discussion of the topic that we have been very much interested. And the reason we were so much interested in the topic is not just keeping the present situation in view, but the largest part of our interest actually comes from our socialist ideology and movement. For example, we have been in a socialist ideology and movement. we believe that working class is the most powerful drive to transform capitalism into socialism. But in the meantime, as you have very convincingly presented, very informatively presented, that a overwhelming portion of the working class, which is something like 95% of the working class, does not actually belong to a class, actually have not come together to constitute a class. That I think is the most pressing question that any socialist or any left or any Marxist need to think about. So that was really a very good thing for us. And the other important part that you emphasized was, and which actually was of high importance and interest, was your uh, position about how we can create an alternative situation in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19. And that was very wonderful, like taxing the rich and taxing the multinational, doing like property tax and decentralization, which will be or can be provide immediate relief to the crisis that have been triggered by precipitated by COVID-19. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate your informed, analytical, and critical presentation. And we, as a part of our foundation, hope that we will continue, or we can continue our cooperation in the days to come in a very aggressive manner, so to speak. I use the word aggressive, like in a very dense manner and frequent manner, and then hopefully produce something that can be very useful and fruitful for our, so to speak, left or socialist transformation that we are struggling for. Professor Ghosh, thank you. Thank you so much once again. And then hopefully, I guess Karuna will conclude our class today, and hope to meet you soon, like to have you in a class soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Khagendra. So I think I would like to take from that note that if everything goes back to normal, I don't know what normal would look like after this pandemic, but I would definitely like to have your physical presence in Nepal so that we can actually be there together in the table and discuss about it. Thank you once again, Jayati.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the very interesting questions.
Are we going to have any Nepali, discussion later, or?
भएका विषयहरूलाई एकचोटि समराइज फर्ममा केही बताइदिने कि केही साथीहरूलाई, जस्तो के विषयमा यो इन्फर्मल सेक्टर, त्यसमा चाहिँ नियो लिबरलले गरेको असर र सरकारसँग पनि केरेलाका केही कुराहरू पनि उहाँले उठाउनु भयो र यसलाई चाहिँ एउटा क्लासको हिसाबले इन्फर्मल सेक्टरका जो मजदुरहरू छन् तिनीहरू सङ्गठित नभइन्जेलसम्म जुन समाजवादी अभियान अगाडि बढ्न नसक्ने, अघि सरले भोट अफ थ्याङ्क्स दिँदा पनि भन्नुभएको थियो, त्यसलाई चाहिँ अलिकति जोडेर एउटा कन्क्लुजन जस्तो 5 मिनट जतिको केही बताइदिनुहुन्छ कि?
धन्यवाद आशिष। म छोटोमा कुरा गर्छु। आज प्रोफेसर घोषले भन्नुभएको कुरा धेरै साथीहरूले धेरै नै बुझ्नु होला, तर थपमा मात्रै र छोटो समरी मात्रै हो यो। खास चाहिँ यो डिस्टिङसन चाहिँ फर्मल र इन्फर्मल सेक्टरबाट उत्पत्ति भएको क्राइसिस, कोरोनाको क्राइसिस चाहिँ अहिले फर्मल र इन्फर्मल सेक्टरको कारणले उत्पत्ति भएको क्राइसिस हो। र इन्फर्मल सेक्टरको चाहिँ उदाहरणको लागि ह्युज पपुलेसन, 95 इन्डियामा 95% चाहिँ वर्करहरू इन्फर्मल सेक्टरमा भएको, र इन्फर्मल सेक्टरमा हुनु भनेको चाहिँ रजिस्ट्रेसन नहुनु, तिनको इम्प्लोइमेन्ट लेटर नहुनु, जसका कारणले उनीहरूलाई कुनै लिगल या सोसियल प्रोटेक्सन हुँदैन। त्यसैले इकोनोमीमा अलिकति उतार चढाव आउने बित्तिकै त्यो इन्फर्मल सेक्टरको मान्छे चाहिँ सबैभन्दा बढी भिक्टिमाइज हुन्छ। र किन पनि भिक्टिमाइज हुन्छ अर्को कारणले भने त्यो इन्फर्मल सेक्टरको मजदुर चाहिँ सङ्गठित हुँदैन, उसको सङ्गठन पनि हुँदैन, उसको लिगल प्रोटेक्सन, सोसियल प्रोटेक्सन त्यस कारणले पनि हुँदैन, र ऊ झनै बढी अप्ठ्यारोमा पर्छ। र अहिलेको क्राइसिस जस्तो अहिले फर्मल सेक्टरको वर्करहरू जति पीडा र दुःखमा छ, त्योभन्दा धेरै गुणा बढी दुःख चाहिँ इन्फर्मल सेक्टरको वर्करमा छ। यो कारण चाहिँ न्यू लिबरलिजमसँग बढी सम्बन्धित छ भन्ने आशयको उहाँको प्रेजेन्टेसन थियो र शीर्षकमा चाहिँ त्यो कुरा राखिएको थियो। तर अब यहाँनिर के भयो भने जति ठुलो इन्फर्मल सेक्टर छ त्यति नै गम्भीर चाहिँ सङ्कट आउँदो रहेछ अर्थतन्त्रमा भनेर देखियो। र उहाँले अलिकति छोटोमा यो माइग्रेन्ट वर्कर्सको कुरा पनि गर्नु। माइग्रेन्ट वर्कर्स बाई डेफिनेसन सबभन्दा मोस्ट अनप्रोटेक्टेड, असुरक्षित मानिने नै भयो। एउटा ठाउँबाट अर्को ठाउँमा गएर काम गर्छ, त्यसका सङ्गठनहरू नहुने भए त्यसलाई मान्छेहरूले हेर्ने दृष्टिकोण पनि भिन्न हुने भयो। र त्यस पछाडि मैले अलिकति छोटो चाहिँ यहाँ रमाइलो, सबैभन्दा आजको बढी प्रोडक्टिभ र म आफै बढी चाहिँ इन्लाइटेन्ड भएको विषय चाहिँ के हो भने यो इमिडिएट कोभिड-19 पछाडि चाहिँ हामी के गर्न सक्छौँ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ सायद हाम्रो देशको अर्थव्यवस्था, हाम्रो देशको सरकार हाम्रो देशको राज्य र हामीले हाम्रो देशको नागरिक भएर सोच्ने हिसाबले पनि धेरै महत्त्वपूर्ण होला भन्ने मलाई लाग्यो। र यो एउटा के हो भने अहिले कोभिड-19 पछाडि हामीसँग ठुलो डिफिसिट हुनेछ, राज्यसँग धेरै राज्यको ढिकुटी निकै रितिएको हुनेछ। त्यति बेला राज्यले आफ्नो ढिकुटी नभरिकन यो कोभिड-19बाट हामीलाई उतार्न सक्दैन। त्यसका लागि चाहिँ त्यसले के गर्नुपर्छ भन्दा एउटा सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कबाट बढीभन्दा बढी पैसा छाप्नुपर्छ भन्ने उहाँले तर्क गर्नुभयो। जो भनेको चाहिँ अहिले साँच्चै नेपालमा डिबेट सुरु गर्नुपर्ने बेला भइसक्यो। त्यो कसरी सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कले बढीभन्दा बढी पैसा छापेर सरकारलाई दिएर, हाम्रो राष्ट्रिय ब्याङ्क भन्छ जसलाई हामी, दिएर चाहिँ अहिलेको कोभिड-19मा इमिडिएट आफ्टरम्याथमा त्यो सक्छ भन्ने तयारी चाहिँ हाम्रो समाजमा बहस पनि सुरु भएको छैन। तर अब हामीले सम्भवतः सुरु गरिने यो कुरालाई यहाँ ल्यायौँ। त्यसपछि धनीहरूलाई चाहिँ उसले अहिले ट्याक्स धेरैभन्दा धेरै लगाउने र प्रोपर्टी ट्याक्स चाहिँ धेरै लगाउने। उहाँले के भन्नु भने धनीलाई र अहिले प्रोपर्टी ट्याक्स इन्डियाका मात्रै नागरिकले लगाउने भने जिडिपीको 10% जति त्यसले हामीलाई रेभेन्यू जेनेरेट गर्छ, त्यो भनेको ह्युज अमाउन्ट हो भन्ने उहाँको तर्क छ। त्यस पछाडि अब मल्टिनेसनल कम्पनीहरूले चाहिँ ठुल्ठुला चाहिँ एमाजोनले इन्डियामा पनि ट्याक्स तिर्दो रहन्छ, फेसबुकले पनि तिर्दो रहन्छ। उनीहरूले चाहिँ ह्युज पैसा चाहिँ इन्डियाबाट आफ्नो ठाउँहरूमा जहाँ ट्याक्स छल्न पाइन्छ त्यस्ता ठाउँहरूमा लान्छन् भन्ने कुरा उहाँले निकाल्नुभयो। र अहिले चाहिँ अब हाम्रो सरकारले सोच्नुपर्ने, तयारी गर्नुपर्ने हाम्रो अर्थव्यवस्थाले सम्भवतः यो कुरा हाम्रो बजेटमा कहीँ पनि दुःखद हिसाबले आएन होला, अथवा हाम्रो सरकारका अर्थशास्त्रीहरू र बाहिर भएका अर्थशास्त्रीहरू यो पोस्ट कोभिड-19 पछाडि के गर्नुपर्छ राज्यले भन्ने बारेमा त छलफल त सुन्न सोच रहेछ। र यो छलफललाई चाहिँ साह्रै महत्त्वका साथ उठाउनु पर्ने मैले देखेँ। मलाई पनि एकदमै रियलाइज भयो। मैले पनि यो साँच्चै भन्नुहुन्छ भने नसोचेकै कुरा हो। एक किसिमले के गरिन्छ सङ्कटका बेला भन्दा इम्प्लोइमेन्ट सुरु भइहाल्छ। इम्प्लोइमेन्ट सुरु भएपछि मान्छेको एक्टिभिटी सुरु भइसकेपछि त इकोनोमी रिभाइभ भइहाल्छ भन्ने
डाक्टर विजय कुमार पौडेलले चाहिँ धेरै नोट छाप्नु चाहिँ यो चाहिँ आत्मघाती हुन्छ, यसले महँगी बढाउँछ भनेर भन्नुभएको छ। जेरेमी कोर्बिनले पनि पैसा छाप्छु भनेर चुनाव लडेको थियो त्यहाँ पनि, यहाँ पनि अहिले प्रोफेसरले भन्नुभयो। अब इन्फ्लेसन पनि हुने कुरा छ। यो डिबेट चाहिँ गर्नै पर्छ जस्तो मलाई लाग्यो।
यो डिबेट चाहिँ के हो भने फेरि पैसा छाप्दा के हुन्छ भन्दा अर्थशास्त्रीहरूकै धारणा के हुन्छ भने पैसा छापेर 1 वर्ष पछाडि जब इकोनोमी सर्कुलेट हुन थाल्छ, प्राण आउँछ त्यसमा, त्यो इकोनोमीलाई त्यसले धान्छ। तर त्यो पैसा कसरी पछि सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कलाई इन्फ्लेसन हुँदैन भन्नुभयो प्रोफेसर घोषले चाहिँ। तुरुन्त चाहिँ इन्फ्लेसन त्यसले ल्याउँदैन, तर त्यो पैसा 1 वर्ष पछाडि कसरी तिर्ने योजना बनाउँछ सरकारले सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कलाई भन्ने कुराको चाहिँ फेरि तयारी गर्नुपर्छ। त्यो तयारी गर्न पाइएन भने चाहिँ इन्फ्लेसन ल्याउँछ होला। कहिलेकाहीँ के हुन्छ भने छापिएको पैसाले नेसेसरीली इन्फ्लेसन नल्याउन सक्दो रहेछ। त्यो पैसाले चाहिँ इन्फ्लेसन नल्याएको पैसाले चाहिँ के गर्दो रहेछ भने यदि त्यो छापिएको पैसाले इकोनोमीलाई पुनर्जीवन दियो भने त्यसले एकदमै इन्फ्लेसन ल्याउने सम्भावना कम हुँदो रहेछ। तर पुनर्जीवन दिएन, प्रोडक्सन, सर्कुलेसन, बाइङ, सेलिङ, कन्जम्सनलाई चाहिँ ट्रिगर गरेन भने अथवा अगाडि बढाएन भने चाहिँ इन्फ्लेसन ल्याउन सक्छ भन्ने यो पनि सामान्य अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङ हो। यो चाहिँ फाइनेन्सियल इकोनोमिस्टहरूले बढी जान्दछन्। तर उहाँकै तर्कमा चाहिँ तुरुन्तै इन्फ्लेसन चाहिँ 1 वर्षभित्रमा चाहिँ ल्याइहाल्दैन, किनभने त्यसले त इकोनोमीलाई चाहिँ तरङ्गमा ल्याउँछ, त्यस कारणले त्यसले बचाउँछ भन्ने उहाँको तर्क हो। सम्भवतः लाग्छ हाम्रो नेपाली समाज साह्रै नराम्रो तयार नभएको विषय चाहिँ यो पोस्ट कोभिड-19 कसरी म्यानेज गर्ने भन्ने होला जस्तो लाग्यो मलाई।
यसमा अब नेक्स्ट क्लास डाक्टर विजय कुमार पौडेलकै छ, पुँजीको सञ्चय। यो हामी चाहिँ मार्क्सले लेखेको चाहिँ च्याप्टर 25 पढ्छौँ आजै बेलुका, त्यो हामी पठाउँछौँ पनि। र त्यही विषयमा पनि आधा घन्टा अथवा 15 मिनट चाहिँ सुनि पनि रहनु भएको छ। यसमा पनि कुराकानी छुट्याएर तयारी गर्न पाए यो छलफल चाहिँ पोस्ट कोभिडलाई पनि हाम्रो सान्दर्भिक हुन्थ्यो कि जस्तो लाग्छ। प्लिज सर, अलिकति अरू केही छन् थप?
आधारभूत रूपले अहिलेको कोरोना क्राइसिस भनेको चाहिँ पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाका कारणले उत्पत्ति भएको बढीभन्दा बढी उत्पत्ति भएको क्राइसिस हो भन्ने ठाउँमा धेरै मान्छेहरू पुगिसकेका छन्। यो मेरो कुनै मौलिक धारणा होइन, किनभने स्वास्थ्य शिक्षा जस्ता स्वास्थ्यमै सबैभन्दा बढी क्राइसिस त स्वास्थ्यमा देखियो। स्वास्थ्यलाई निजीकरण गर्ने, स्वास्थ्यलाई निजी क्षेत्रलाई जिम्मा दिने कुराले कोरोना क्राइसिस कत्रो ठुलो सङ्कट ल्यायो, अथवा यो सङ्कट चाहिँ पुँजीवादको सङ्कट यहाँ आएर अभिव्यक्त भयो भन्ने ठाउँमा हामी पुग्ने नै भयौँ। अब यसको निकास चाहिँ के हो भन्ने कुरा एउटा पाटो भयो। अब पुँजीवादको क्राइसिस कसरी पनि हो भने इन्डियामा 95% अथवा ठुलो सङ्ख्यामा मान्छेहरू इन्फर्मल सेक्टरमा हुने कुरा चाहिँ पुँजीको लाभको लागि, ठुल्ठुला कम्पनीहरूलाई बढी फाइदा निचोर्नको लागि बढी उपयोगी हुन्छ। त्यसैले उनीहरूले चाहिँ के अरे आफू फर्मल सेक्टरमा रहँदै पनि वर्करहरूको ठुलो हिस्सालाई अथवा अधिकतम भन्दा अधिकतम हिस्सालाई चाहिँ इन्फर्मल सेक्टरमा राख्न चाहन्छन्, किनभने त्यसो गर्यो भने ठुला बेनिफिट्सहरू, प्रोटेक्सनहरू, हेल्थ इन्सुरेन्सहरू दिनु पर्दैन र नियमित तलब पनि दिनु नपरेपछि उनीहरूको नाफा अधिकतम हुन्छ। त्यसैले हामीले बुझ्दा के हो भने सरल भाषामा अहिलेको कोरोना क्राइसिस चाहिँ एउटा कुनै जीवाणु या कुनै जीव जस्तो देखिने अणु का कारणले उत्पत्ति भएको क्राइसिस भन्दा हाम्रो संसार आज पुँजीवादी व्यवस्था भएको कारणले त्यो पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाभित्र उत्पत्ति भएको सङ्कट हो भन्ने हिसाबको समाजशास्त्रीय व्याख्या बढी चाहिँ कन्भिन्सिङ हुन्छ भन्ने मलाई लाग्छ। यो कुनै जैविकताबाट या कुनै रसायन या अणुबाट या कणबाट उत्पत्ति भएको भन्दा हाम्रो समाज व्यवस्था जसरी अर्गनाइज भएको छ, हाम्रो अर्थव्यवस्था जस्तो छ त्यसले उत्पत्ति गरेको सङ्कट हो कि भन्ने बढी देखिन्छ।
कसैको केही प्रश्न छ भने च्याट बक्समा राखिदिनु होला।
म बसन्त जोशी सुर्खेतबाट। अहिले जस्तो डिस्कस भयो कोरोना पछिको सेक्टरमा, तर यहाँ एउटा अर्को पोइन्ट के जोडिनु पर्थ्यो भने अब यो कोरोना पछि इन्फर्मल सेक्टरहरू जो छन् उहाँले भने जस्तो अनि इन्फर्मल सेक्टरका जति पनि इम्प्लोयरहरू छन् उनीहरूको लागि चाहिँ खास के गर्नुपर्छ? त्यति नै इम्प्लोय जति छन् सबै एकैचोटि झ्याप्पै रोजगारी पाउने र यिनीहरूले गतिशील अर्थव्यवस्था बनाउने त होइनन्। यसको लागि जसले खाइपाइ आएको छन् तिनीहरू फर्मली सेक्टरमा चाहिँ जाँदै जाने भएको र यसलाई चाहिँ कसरी व्यवस्थापन गर्न सकिन्छ? यो त मेन पोइन्ट, चुनौती, च्यालेन्ज नै यही मात्रै होला कि जस्तो लाग्छ। यसमा डिस्कस गर्न पाए हुन्थ्यो।
ठिक हो। त तपाईँलाई नि के लाग्छ? तपाईँ बढी सुरु गरौँ। तपाईँलाई के लाग्छ छोटोमा 1 मिनेटमा?
मेरो केसमा त कस्तो भने अब यिनीहरूको लागि जस्तो कम्पनीहरूमा अहिले जसरी प्रतिस्थापनको नीति लिएको छ जस्तो आफ्नो देशको लागि मात्रै राख्ने भन्ने कुरा जो छ त्यसमा अब यो मेसिनरी चिजहरूको प्रयोग गर्नै पर्ने ठाउँमा मात्रै प्रयोग गरेर अन्य ठाउँमा चाहिँ यस्ता किसिमको काम मात्रै लगाउने कि जस्तो अहिले डोजरको प्रयोग भइरहेको छ त्यस्तो ठाउँमा चाहिँ जस्तो डोजरबाट डोड खन्नेहरू त्यसै लिएर यी सबै जति पनि कुराहरू छन् यसमा अधिकतम मानव जनशक्तिको मात्रै प्रयोग गर्ने नीति लिन सकियो भने, मेसिनलाई चाहिँ प्रतिस्थापन गर्न सकियो भने मेसिनले एकजनाले लैजाने खर्च उसले चाहिँ धेरैजना मजदुर पालिन सक्छन्। यसरी इन्फर्मल सेक्टरकोले पनि आफ्नो तरिकाले इकोनोमिकल रेज गर्न सक्छ भन्ने मेरो बुझाइ छ। यसमा अझै कन्क्लुड गर्न पाए बेटर हुन्थ्यो सर।
बसन्तजी के हो भने हाम्रो प्रश्न चाहिँ के थियो भने इन्फर्मललाई कसरी फर्मलतिर लाने भन्ने हो। तपाईँको तरिकाले चाहिँ इन्फर्मल अहिले रहेको इन्फर्मल झन् बढी इन्फर्मल हुने खतरा हुन्छ भन्ने देखिन्छ। यदि इन्फर्मललाई फर्मलमा लानु चाहिँ अलि राम्रो प्रगतिशील कदम मान्ने हो भने यो चाहिँ तपाईँको प्रश्न फेरि पनि एकदमै महत्त्वपूर्ण प्रश्न नै छ। यो सोच्नका लागि हामी यसलाई राखौँ र फेरि अगाडि अरू कुनै साथीहरूको प्रश्न।
एउटा क्वेसन छ मदन कुमार खरेलजीको, कोभिडको उत्पत्ति चाहिँ पुँजीवादी नै हो भन्ने बारे थप आए हुन्थ्यो भन्ने कुरा गर्नुभएको छ। अनि बुद्धनाथ शर्माले चाहिँ मोर पिपल फ्रम फर्मल सेक्टर आर अल्सो गोइङ टु बी थ्रोन इन्टु इन्फर्मल सेक्टर इभन इट इज सेड बाई आइएलओ भन्दै हुनुहुन्छ सर।
ओके, हो त्यो अब ठुल्ठुला कम्पनीहरू बन्द हुने परिस्थिति बनेपछि त फर्मलकाहरू इन्फर्मलतिर जाने प्रक्रिया सुरु नै हुन्छ। ती कम्पनीहरूलाई कोल्याप्सबाट बचाउनको लागि चाहिँ अघि अल्टरनेटिभ के हो भन्ने कुरा आएको हो। त्यो कुरा सही हो। अर्को चाहिँ कोभिडको उत्पत्ति नै पुँजीवादी हो होइन, कोभिडको उत्पत्ति पुँजीवादी होइन कि कोभिडले जुन सङ्कट अहिले संसारमा ल्याएको छ यो सङ्कट चाहिँ आधारभूत रूपले पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाभित्र उत्पत्ति भएको सङ्कट हो। यदि हामीसँग पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाभन्दा अर्को बेग्लै खाले मान्नुहोस् हामीले खोजेको समाजवादी व्यवस्था थियो भने कोभिडको सङ्कट यति गहिरो हुँदैन थियो। यो कुरा चाहिँ संसारका धेरै समाजवादीहरूले भन्दैछन्। तपाईँले केरलामै पनि कोभिडलाई कसरी नियन्त्रण गरियो भन्ने कुरा हेर्नुहुन्छ भने यद्यपि केरला पूर्ण रूपले समाजवादी राज्य होइन तर त्यहाँ राज्यको भूमिका छ। स्वास्थ्य र शिक्षामा राज्यको ठुलो लगानी भएको हुनाले कोभिडलाई नियन्त्रण गर्न कसरी त्यहाँ भएको चाहिँ सार्वजनिक स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्रले सफलताका साथ काम गरौँ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ महत्त्वपूर्ण छ। त्यसैले हामीले बुझ्दा के भने एउटा भाइरसले ल्याएको सङ्कट जुन हो त्यो चाहिँ पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाका कारणले यति गहिरो भएको हो भनेर बुझ्नुपर्छ भन्न खोजिएको हो खास चाहिँ।
अब प्रश्नहरू यहाँ आएका सकिए, त्यो भइसके पछाडि सम्भवतः अब आजको सेसन क्लोज गरेर अब नेक्स्ट कक्षाको तयारी गरौँ होला साथीहरू। अर्को पालि
नेक्स्ट कक्षाको पनि एकचोटि जानकारी सबैलाई दिनु आशिष छ।
नेक्स्ट कक्षा 4 बजे छ अर्को शनिबार। डाक्टर विजय कुमार पौडेलले पुँजी सञ्चयको प्रक्रियाको विषयमा कुराकानी गर्नुहुनेछ र त्यो बेसिकल्ली चाहिँ मार्क्सको क्यापिटलको भोल्युम 1 को च्याप्टर 25 मा आधारित रहेर नै त्यो कुराकानी हुन्छ। हामी टेक्स्टभन्दा बाहिर गएर नगर्ने भनेर भनिएको छ यो पालि। त्यो भइसके पछाडि मार्क्सको पुँजीको 25 हामी छिटै यो एउटा मेटेरियल नेपाली अनुवाद छ ठिकठिकैको जुन नेपाली मार्केटमा भेटिन्छ त्यो साथीहरूलाई आज बेलुका नै पठाउँछौँ र चाहिँ अर्को पालि त्यसमा पढेर आएर एकदमै राम्रो छलफल होस्, धेरै प्रश्नोत्तरहरू यहाँनिर होस् र हामीले पुँजीको प्रक्रियालाई निकै राम्ररी बुझेर मात्रै हामीले पुँजीवादबाट विकल्प खोज्ने प्रक्रिया चाहिँ अझ व्यवहारिक र अझ सम्भव गराउन सकिन्छ भन्ने हाम्रो ठहर हो। अब यहाँ एउटा क्विकली एउटा क्वेसन आयो नवीन ढुङ्गाना चाहिँ कोभिडको सङ्कट भनेको स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र निजीकरणले हो, तसर्थ पुँजीवादी चरित्रका कारण हाम्रो अवस्था यस्तो भएको हो भन्ने निष्कर्षमा जाने हो खगेन्द्र सर भन्ने क्वेसन छ।
कोभिडको सङ्कट भनेको स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र निजीकरणको हो, तसर्थ पुँजीवादी चरित्रका कारण हाम्रो अवस्था यस्तो भएको हो भन्ने निष्कर्षमा एउटा जस्तो सङ्कट त थुप्रै कारणले आयो। सङ्कट जति गहिरो हो त्यसका थुप्रै कारण थिए। हाम्रो अर्थव्यवस्था थियो, हाम्रो स्वास्थ्य व्यवस्था थियो, हाम्रो तयारी हरेक किसिमको थियो। तर सङ्कट चाहिँ हामीले कोभिडलाई जसरी नियन्त्रण गर्नु पर्थ्यो जुन प्रभावका साथ त्यो गर्न सकिएन। त्यो गर्न नसक्नुको पछाडि चाहिँ स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र ठुलो मात्रामा राजकीय क्षेत्रभन्दा निजी क्षेत्रमा थियो। तपाईँले चाहिँ अहिले निजी अस्पतालहरूले जुन व्यवहार गरे त्यो व्यवहारबाट त प्रश्न हुँदैन र, अथवा राज्यको चाहिँ कोभिडलाई एकैचोटि नियन्त्रणमा लिन सक्ने एकदम ठुलो क्षमता चाहिँ राज्यसँग आफ्ना ठुल्ठुला हस्पिटलहरू स्वास्थ्य व्यवस्था नहुने कुराले त्यसलाई इङ्गित गर्दैन। हामीले त्यही कुरा भन्न खोजेको खास गरेर। अनि तपाईँ जहाँ जहाँ चाहिँ कोभिडको सफलतापूर्वक नियन्त्रण गरियो, ठुलो मात्रामा नियन्त्रण भनेको नियन्त्रण नै होइन, ती ठाउँहरूमा चाहिँ स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्रमा जहाँसुकै हेर्नुभयो भने पनि स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्रमा राज्यको ठुलो भूमिका भएको देखिन्छ। जस्तो क्युबामा यो समस्या भएन, भेनेजुएलामा समस्या भएन, चाइनिजहरूले चाहिँ राज्यको ठुलो भूमिकाको कारण यसलाई प्रारम्भमा नियन्त्रण गरे। केरला भन्ने सानो गरिब राज्यले इन्डियामा ठुलो प्रभावका साथ यसलाई नियन्त्रण गर्यो। युरोपका चाहिँ जहाँ स्वास्थ्य व्यवस्था चाहिँ सार्वजनिक क्षेत्रभित्र छन् ती देशहरूले पनि धेरै राम्ररी यसलाई नियन्त्रण गरे। तपाईँले पछि त एउटा देशले चाहिँ त्यो निजी क्षेत्रको कारणले उत्पत्ति भएको समस्यालाई ध्यानमा राखेर सबै स्वास्थ्य सेवालाई चाहिँ राष्ट्रियकरण गर्ने योजना पनि ल्यायो, यो पनि हामीले सुन्यौँ। त्यसैले एउटा कारण चाहिँ त्यो हो थुप्रै कारणमध्ये। त्यसैका कारणले यो सबै बिग्रेको भन्दा पनि एउटा त्यो कारण चाहिँ राम्रो भइदिएको भए, स्वास्थ्य व्यवस्था सार्वजनिक क्षेत्रमा भएको भए हामीले अहिले भन्दा 100औं गुणा 50औं गुणा 1000औं गुणा भनौँ न प्रभावका साथ यसलाई नियन्त्रण गर्न सक्थ्यौँ भन्ने कुरामा चाहिँ विश्वस्त हुन सकिन्छ वस्तुतः।
भियतनामको उदाहरण बारे पनि तुलसीदास महर्जन सर र हाम्रो सुदीप श्रेष्ठ सरले बताउँदै हुनुहुन्छ।
सर
हजुर,
चाइना र अमेरिकाकै हामीले अलिक कम्पेरेटिभ स्टडी गर्ने हो भने चाहिँ चाइनामा निजी क्षेत्रको स्वास्थ्यमा भूमिका बढी रहेछ अमेरिकामा भन्दा, होइन? यद्यपि चाइनाले कन्ट्रोलमा ल्यायो, जस्तो हामीले भेनेजुएला वा क्युबाकै उदाहरण त दियो, होइन? यसमा चाहिँ ओभरअल स्वास्थ्य क्षेत्र सरकारसँग टोटल्ली छ कि छैन भन्दा पनि टोटल भएका इन्स्टिट्युसनहरू जो प्राइभेट हुन् या पब्लिक इन्स्टिट्युसन हुन् तिनमा ओभरअल गभर्मेन्टको कन्ट्रोल छ कि छैन भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट रहेछ कि जस्तो चाहिँ लाग्यो कि।
हो, एक्ज्याक्ट तपाईँले भनेको कुरा ठिक हो। तर त्यो कसरी बुझ्नुपर्छ भने गभर्मेन्टको नियन्त्रण हुने, गभर्मेन्टको नियमन हुने कुरा भनेको चाहिँ निजी क्षेत्र अर्ध निजी क्षेत्र मात्रै हो। किनभने स्वामित्व चाहिँ निजीको भए पनि गभर्मेन्टको इन्स्ट्रक्सन मान्न कानुन रूपले बाध्य हुन्छ र गभर्मेन्टसँग उसलाई आवश्यकता परेको बेला त्यस्ता निजी क्षेत्रहरूलाई सञ्चालनमा ल्याउने, नियमन गर्ने, प्रयोग गर्ने क्षमता हुन्छ भने त्यो सिचुएसन फरक हो। त्यसलाई पनि हामीले के भनेको भने राज्यको या सरकारको भूमिका कम हुनुपर्छ कि बढी हुनुपर्छ भनेर नापेको। जहाँ बढी हुन्छ त्यसलाई सार्वजनिक क्षेत्रको एक्सपान्सन भनेर बुझ्छौँ हामी। जस्तो निजी चाहिँ हस्पिटल चाहिँ जापानमा हस्पिटलहरू निजी हुन्छन्, तर जापानमा चाहिँ सरकारको नियमन यति कडा छ कि 1990-2000 सम्म त तपाईँले एउटा घाउको यति सेन्टिमिटर गहिरो घाउको जापानभरिका हस्पिटलले त्यति नै मात्रै पैसा लिन पाउँथे। यो भनेको चाहिँ हेर्दाखेरि तपाईँले नर्सिङ होमहरू अथवा कुनै हस्पिटल निजी जस्तो देख्नुहुन्छ, तर सरकारको नियमनभित्र त्यो यति गाँसिएको छ कि त्यो निजी हो कि सार्वजनिक छुटिँदैन क्या। त्यसले व्यवहार चाहिँ सार्वजनिकको जस्तो गरिरहेको हुन्छ। त्यस कारणले हामीले भन्न खोजेको चाहिँ सिधै कुन स्वामित्वमा थियो भन्दा सरकारको भूमिका र त्यो भूमिका लागू गर्ने क्षमता कस्तो थियो भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ महत्त्वपूर्ण हो है फेरि पनि। त्यसैले हामीले निजी या सार्वजनिक क्षेत्र बलियो हुनु, सरकार बलियो हुनु भनेको उसको भूमिका धेरै हुनु या बलियो हुनु हो भन्ने अर्थमा लिँदा जेनेरिक सेन्समा।
सर त्यो स्टेट ब्याङ्कले बढी पैसाहरू प्रिन्ट गर्यो भने अनि आउटपुट त नहुँदाखेरि इन्फ्लेसनमा जाँदैन र त्यसको अलिकति एक्सप्लेन गरिदिनु न।
त्यो चाहिँ कस्तो, म चाहिँ अर्थशास्त्री कम भएँ तर पनि मैले बुझेकोसम्म तपाईँहरूलाई बताउँछु कि जस्तो पैसा बढी छापिएपछि अर्थशास्त्रको सामान्य नियमले इन्फ्लेसनमा जान्छ भन्छ, होइन? तर के हुँदो रहेछ भने पटक पटक दुनियाँका थुप्रै देशहरूले त्यो जस्तो बेलायतमा त्यो पटक पटक भएको थियो कि जेरेमी कोर्बिनले म पैसा छाप्छु भन्दाखेरि केही मान्छेहरूले उडाए, तर उनले यति इतिहासका उदाहरणहरू देखाए कि इभन बुर्जुवा अर्थशास्त्रीले पनि जेरेमी कोर्बिनको पैसा छाप्ने कुरा लजिकल हो, ऱ्यासनल हो भनेर त्यो मुद्दा पछि त्यतिकै सेलायो, जो जेरेमी कोर्बिन त्यसमा पपुलर भयो। हुँदो रहेछ के भने तपाईँले छापेको पैसाले अर्थव्यवस्थालाई पुनर्जीवित गर्यो भने इन्फ्लेसन हुँदैन या कम हुन्छ, या त्यो इन्फ्लेसन सरकारले अर्को पालि नेक्स्ट इयरमा चाहिँ नियन्त्रण गर्न सक्छ। अब तपाईँले छापेको पैसा मात्रै छाप्नु हो, तर उत्पादन, वितरण र त्यसको कन्जम्सन चाहिँ खुला भएन या त्यो अगाडि बढेन, त्यो गति लिएन भने चाहिँ तपाईँको इन्फ्लेसन जरुर हुन्छ। किनभने यो चाहिँ फेरि अर्थशास्त्र फाइनेन्स इकोनोमिक्सको इतिहास पढ्ने साथीहरूले बढी बताउनुहुन्छ हामीलाई कि संसारमा कति कति ठाउँमा कसरी पैसा छापिएर इकोनोमीलाई रेस्क्यु गरियो भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ ती साथीहरूसँग पछिल्ला हाम्रा क्लासहरूमा हामी लिन्छौँ होला। अरू साथीहरूलाई पनि दिउँ त अवसर ल।
मैले एउटा पोइन्ट थप्दिएँ, के थप्दिएँ भने जस्तो यो जो पैसा नोट छाप्ने कुरा छ नि, अहिलेको पेन्डेमिकले चाहिँ पुँजीपतिहरूसँग जो भएको पैसा छ उनीहरूसँग त्यो चाहिँ होल्ड रहन्छ होइन। यो कन्डिसनमा सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कले नोट छाप्यो भने त्यो नोट चाहिँ मार्केटमा सर्कुलेसन गर्न सक्छ, त्यो गभर्मेन्टकै प्लान अनुसार होइन। फेरि 1 वर्षपछि गभर्मेन्टले आफ्नै प्लान अनुसार त्यो मार्केटबाट फेरि त्यो चाहिँ सेन्ट्रल ब्याङ्कमा तान्न सक्छ। त्यो कारणले चाहिँ जसको कारणले इन्फ्लेसन क्रिएट हुँदैन भन्ने लजिक हो जस्तो लाग्छ जयती घोषको चाहिँ।
होइन हो, भइहाल्यो भने म्यानेजेबल हुन्छ भन्ने।
तर यसमा इन्ट्रेस्टिङ होला जस्तो विजय कुमार पौडेलको चाहिँ यो एकदम नन इकोनोमिक सल्लाह हो भन्ने कुरा छ। हामी यसमा बढी तथ्यहरू इतिहासका अझ बढी चाहिँ तथ्यहरू फेला पारेर एक ठाउँ राखेर सल्लाह गर्यौँ भने मलाई लाग्छ यो ठिक ठाउँमा जान्छ होला।
तुलसीजीले केही थप्न आँट्नु भएको थियो? तुलसीदास महर्जनजी तपाईँ हुनुहुन्छ त्यहाँ? के तपाईँको भियतनामको इक्जाम्पल केही थपिदिने हो तपाईँले?
भियतनामको मसँग त्यस्तो चाहिँ डिटेलले त छैन होइन, तर कुरा के त भन्दाखेरि जुन अघि प्लानिङको जुन कुरा आयो नि त होइन, राज्य चाहिँ एउटा हर वखत एउटा प्लान इकोनोमीमा जाँदाखेरि राज्य प्लान इकोनोमीमा पनि जाने अनि जेन्युन पनि हुने। अथवा भनौँ न यो हेल्थ सेक्टरमा जुन राज्यले एउटा राज्यको दायित्व अन्तर्गत जुन नेपालमा पनि अहिले मौलिक अधिकार भनेर भनिएको छ, तर के त भन्दाखेरि त्यो इम्प्लिमेन्टेसनमा गएको चाहिँ छैन। अब भियतनामले चाहिँ के त भन्दाखेरि अरू कुरा त छँदैछ, स्वास्थ्यको हेल्थको कुरा जाँदाखेरि हेल्थलाई राज्यको दायित्वको रूपमा लिएर उसले चाहिँ के त भन्दाखेरि यो पुरै एउटा चाहिँ प्लानमा जाँदाखेरि सुरुदेखि नै उसले जुन खालको सेन्स गरेर प्लान वेमा गयो, त्यसो गर्दाखेरि कम एउटा क्षतिमा अथवा कम यो लगानीमा पनि यो पेन्डेमिकलाई उसले चाहिँ भित्रन दिएन, अथवा त्यसको चाहिँ असर एकदमै न्यून रूपमा मात्रै उनीहरूले चाहिँ भोग्नु परेको भयो भन्ने कुरा, त्यो राम्रो उदाहरण भियतनामको छ। मलाई जहाँसम्म लाग्छ भियतनामको त्यति चाहिँ बाहिर आएको चाहिँ छैन, तर त्यहाँ एकजना पनि मरेको चाहिँ छैन, 400-500 कति मात्रै इन्फेक्टेड चाहिँ भएको चाहिँ छ होइन। र भियतनाम एउटा चाहिँ के त भन्दाखेरि इकोनोमिक रूपले त्यस्तो चाहिँ धेरै चाहिँ माथि उठेको देश पनि होइन, तर सोसलिस्ट जुन प्लान चाहिँ वेमा त्यो गएको एउटा राष्ट्रको रूपमा उसले त्यो यो पेन्डेमिकलाई जसरी चाहिँ उसले चाहिँ एउटा चाहिँ त्यसबाट चाहिँ त्यसमा विजय प्राप्त गर्यो, त्यो चाहिँ धेरै नै उदाहरणीय कुरा छ जस्तो चाहिँ मलाई लाग्छ। तर त्यो कम मात्र उदाहरणको रूपमा आउने गरेको कारणले गर्दाखेरि त्यो एउटा हाम्रो अध्ययनको विषय हुन सक्छ भनेर मलाई त्यस्तो लाग्छ।
यो राम्रो इक्जाम्पल, धन्यवाद ल।
एकछिन अशेष कमरेड, एकजना साथीले अघिदेखि हात उठाउनु भयो त, उहाँले गरेर अनि कन्क्लुड गरेर मदन कुमार खरेलले अघि हातदेखि हात उठाउनु।
3टा क्वेसन छ है त्यहाँ।
कसको?
मदनजीले बोल्दै गर्दा एउटा नेपालमा अब गर्ने के भन्ने दिपेश बरालको एउटा क्वेसन छ, अनि अर्को चाहिँ अहिले कोभिडले गर्दा सञ्जीव गिरीको क्वेसन, अर्को इन्टरनेसनल पोलिटिक चेन्जको बारेमा केही भनिदिनु न। युएसए को अलिक चाइना विरुद्ध लागेको छ, कोभिडको छानबिन गर्न नि माग गरेको छ, यस्तो सिचुएसनले चाइना र युएसए को कोल्ड वार सुरु भएको हो भन्ने क्वेसन छ। र सम्बल चौलागाईले चाहिँ सोशलिजम एन्ड क्यापिटलिजम बोथ निड्स द प्रोडक्सन अफ गुड्स एन्ड सर्भिसेस बट द प्रब्लम हियर इज proper implementation of policies regarding pandemic and health emergency in all the nations of world भन्ने कुरा आएको छ। यसमा क्विकली के भनिदिनुहुन्छ?
पछाडि सोशलिजम र क्यापिटलिजमको के क्वेसन, पछाडि क्वेसन के हो खास?
क्वेसन होइन, यो चाहिँ टिप्पणी जस्तो हो, हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सी भन्ने कुरा छ।
त्यो हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सी लगाएर के गरिन्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ महत्त्वपूर्ण हुन्छ। राज्यले के भूमिका खेल्छ? हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सी लगाएर नागरिकका अधिकार मात्रै कटौती गर्छ, रेगुलेसन मात्रै गर्छ, तपाईँको मोबिलिटी मात्रै रोक्छ कि राज्यको अघि तुलसीजीले भने जस्तो जहाँ भियतनाममा गरियो त्यस्तै किसिमको, या साउथ कोरियामा पनि राम्रै इक्जाम्पल देखिन्छ, यद्यपि त्यो पुँजीवादी कन्ट्री हो, राज्यको भूमिका बलियो भएकाले त्यो गरेर चाहिँ अगाडि आउँछ कि हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सी आफैमा त केही वस्तु त केही होइन नि त। हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सीमा त यो काम गर्न अहिलेको नर्मल सिचुएसनमा नसकिने हुनाले इमर्जेन्सी घोषणा गरेर गर्न सकिने हुनाले त्यसलाई हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सी मान्ने र हेल्थ सेक्टरसम्ममा इमर्जेन्सी ल लाउने भन्नेको सामान्यता। तर के गर्ने भन्ने वस्तु त त्यो योजना आइसकेपछि मात्रै हेल्थ इमर्जेन्सीको आउटकम के हो भन्न सोच्न सकिन्छ। त्योभन्दा माथिल्लो प्रश्न यो पुँजीवादको सङ्कट, यो चाहिँ साह्रै हामीले सोच्नैकै लागि, अध्ययन गर्नकै लागि जरुर ठुला प्रश्न। अब यो पुँजीवादी व्यवस्थाको अर्डर, चाइना अमेरिका कोल्ड वार, यो सबै हामीले देखिरहेका छौँ। तर एउटा सम्भावना, संसारको अलि फरक चित्रको सम्भावना के हो भने, जुन देशहरूले आफ्नो अर्थतन्त्र र मान्छेलाई कोभिडबाट बढी बचाउँछन्, सम्भवतः ती देशहरू चाहिँ अबको भविष्यमा अलि बढी संसारको अर्थव्यवस्थामा तिनको भूमिका बढ्दै जान्छ र तिनको आन्तरिक रूपले पनि अर्थव्यवस्था मजबुत हुन्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ सामान्य अर्थशास्त्रको ज्ञान राख्दा पनि देखिन्छ। जस्तो अमेरिकाले आफूलाई धेरै बचाउन सकेन अर्थव्यवस्थालाई, र चाइनाले बचाएर अर्थव्यवस्थालाई रिभाइभ गर्यो भने चाइनाले यो प्रक्रियाबाट बढी लाभ लिन्छ। त्यसको उल्टो, चाइनाले बचाउन सकेन र अमेरिकाले बढी बचायो र अर्थव्यवस्थालाई पुनर्जीवित गर्यो भने अमेरिकाले लिएला, इन्डियाले त्यो गर्न सक्यो भने इन्डियाले लिन्छ। त्यसैले अब के देखिन्छ भने यो पोस्ट कोभिड-19 एरामा चाहिँ कुन देशका व्यवस्थाहरूले आफ्नो अर्थव्यवस्थालाई ठिकठाक गर्न छिटो गर्छन्, त्यसमा उनीहरूले ठुलो तुलनात्मक लाभ लिन्छन् र संसारको अर्थव्यवस्था त्यसरी नै अलिक बढी प्रभावित हुन्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ सोच्न सामान्य रूपले सकिन्छ। तर साँच्चै के हुन्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ भविष्यमा मात्रै बताउन सकिन्छ, हाइन्ड साइडमा मात्रै।
अब करिब करिब हामी टुङ्ग्यौँ होला। अरू के कसैको, किनकि अघि हल्ला आएर मैले
हुन्छ हल्ला चाहिँ भन्दा साथीहरूले प्रश्न लेख्नु नै भए ठिक हुने रहेछ के, खोलिदिने बित्तिकै सबै हल्ला सुनिदो रहेछ।
त्यो भएर ल अब कन्क्लुडै गरौँ होला सर।
ल सब गरौँ। ल
सबैलाई धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद। अर्को कक्षाको बारेमा पनि हामीले बताइहाल्यौँ। हामी अर्को हप्ता फेरि भेट्छौँ, सामग्रीहरू आउँछन्। सबैलाई कक्षामा आइदिनु भयो, भाग लिइदिनु भयो र यो छलफल निरन्तर चल्ने नै छ। सबैलाई धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद।